Welcome back. Now we're going to look at some practice diploma exam questions that are not necessarily political or economic, but more of the foreign policy part of the course, whether it be the Cold War or whether it be the contemporary world. So we're going to begin with the 2010-2011 diploma exam and just see what's there and see where the answers are. I'm going to actually have two booklets open so that I can have the questions and sources both on display at the same time. So let's find a question that's Cold War related, and then we'll get started. Okay, we've already done these ones in previous lessons, but I know there's some we left. There's some right there, 29 and 30. So let's take a look at questions 29 and 30 and see if we can see the connections to the contemporary world, Cold War. So the cartoon depicts superpower leaders implementing a policy. So it's matching. So many of these questions end up being matching. So we have to look at the cartoon and say, okay, am I seeing détente? Am I seeing containment? Am I seeing brinkmanship? Am I seeing collective security? So we have two leaders. We have JFK and we have Nikita Khrushchev. And they say, let's get a lock for this thing. And they're trying to lock down the nuclear war. And it's happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So are they practicing collective security? Well, the Soviets had their gang. The Americans had their gang. It was Warsaw Pact against NATO. And each of their gangs had collective security against the other, but they didn't have combined collective security. The idea that they were both protecting themselves against, a third power like China. So collective security is not happening. Brinkmanship. Let's go to the brink of war. Now, typically when we think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they're going to the brink of war to basically play this game of foreign policy chicken with their opponent, that if we go to the brink of war, maybe the opponent will back down and I will get my way. Well, here they've gone to the brink of war, and that's the problem. And now what are they implementing? Are they implementing brinkmanship? No, they're trying to end brinkmanship because they fear the consequences of it. Containment. Well, they're definitely containing something. They're trying to put the lid on it, right? So in a sense that there is a pull to the word containment, but in the Cold War, the word containment was the Americans containing the spread of Soviet influence around the world, stopping the spread of communism. So this wouldn't be an appropriate use of the term containment, although they are trying to contain the nuclear war. That's not what the policy of containment meant. Policy is détente. A détente is a relaxation of tension. This idea that, man, we need to use diplomacy. We need to talk about our issues rather than using conflict. So what we're seeing here is détente. And number 30. Which of the following actions occurred as a direct result of the situation depicted? So as a consequence of this, what happened next kind of thing, right? So was it development of space-based weapons? Well, they're trying to contain the arms race, right? They're trying to limit the arms race. They're trying to stop the arms race. They're trying to use diplomacy. This is kind of against the policy of that. If we said détente here, then this is like an arms race. Why would they go from saying, let's talk about our issues to, man, let's make some weapons, put them in space? Reduction in the production of nuclear weapons. There's a pull there for sure, right? That, you could make the argument that nuclear war is their fear, that because of this, there's a reduction. You could make that unless you actually looked at history and said, did they reduce the production of nuclear weapons following the Cuban Missile Crisis? And the unfortunate answer is no, they did not. So you could be persuaded to pick B. Logically, it fits, but historically, it doesn't fit, as well as C, improvement of communications. So even détente is defined by improved communications improved diplomacy, but even at a time of diplomacy, they kept making nuclear weapons. And that's why C is a better answer than D. Introduction of democratic reforms in communist countries. Sure, some communist countries experimented with a little bit of reform in the 60s, but most of that reform won't happen until the late 1980s and the Velvet Revolutions of 89. So the real dilemma here might be between B and C, and the history shows C to be the better answer because there was a lot of increased diplomacy of communication between the superpowers, but there's still production of nuclear weapons. So if we go to the internet and we look at production of nuclear weapons, yep, it's got to be painful to watch me do this, during the Cold War. And maybe if we looked at an image, hopefully there's a nice chart. Here you can see in the chart that this would be the time of the cartoon. You can see Soviets, they just keep making them. The Americans, they just keep making them. So more so the Soviets, because the Americans had a huge lead at this point, huge gap, but there definitely wasn't a reduction. Now, if you had that, that would make that answer a whole lot easier. But and you don't get to just Google stuff during the diploma. But I'm just showing you why the answer is C and not B. All right. Let's see if there's any more Cold War related ones. I think we went through this one already when we looked at propaganda techniques of dictators. Yeah, I believe we did. Cause situation, Nazi Germany. We did that one again in the contemporary or the political unit. Not many to look at here. We've already looked at that. 51 and 52 we looked at earlier with the Soviet system. So the only other ones are ones without sources. So let's go to the end of the exam. So we're seeing that there's not a ton of release items for this part of the course. So that one we looked at economically, politically, economically. Beginning of the course, politically, economically. Great man. From the perspective of an internationalist, UN military action in response to ethnic and civil unrest. So internationalist, we're UN, but we're responding to unrest. Is it acceptable or unacceptable? Acceptable because global stability promotes economic growth. Or acceptable because human rights is a moral obligation. Well, A might be to the perspective of a capitalist, a free market enthusiast, but just to say we're intervening because it's good for the economy seems more limited to someone that might say, you know what, we need to do it because human rights are being abused. It's an ethnic and civil unrest. We need to parachute ourselves into this situation because it's our moral obligation to come to the aid of others. So even though there is a pull to A from the perspective of a capitalist, because it's an interventionist, an internationalist, that's more of a human rights connection to that term, that's why we're going to go with B. The effectiveness of the UN has been questioned most strongly by proponents of national security because the UN, well, we've talked about this one maybe in the past too, that although some people may question the relevancy of the UN, mostly the main problem of the UN comes back to 1945 and the leadership and power, the roots of it from the geopolitical circumstances ending World War II. So that's why it might be C. 69 is a good one from the Cold War unit. The acquisition of satellite states by the Soviet Union would be viewed negatively by a supporter of the concept of. So who would look at acquiring satellite states by the USSR to be a negative thing? deterrence, brinkmanship, political security, or national self-determination. So in order to really think this through, make it a little more clear, saying like Soviet Union making Poland into a satellite state. Now, would that be violating deterrence? Would that be violating brinkmanship, violating collective security, or violating national self-determination? Well, it's violating the national self-determination of those Polish people, that they don't get to determine for themselves whether to follow the Soviets' model. They're now a satellite of the Soviets. That, a satellite by definition is going around something else. So the moon is going around the Earth, and therefore the moon doesn't get to determine for itself its path. Its path is chosen by the Earth because it's staying relative to the Earth, just like the Earth going around the sun, etc., etc. That they're dependent, they're following the lead of, in this case, Moscow, and therefore it's national self-determination. From an American government perspective, direct military involvement in the Vietnam War was necessary to, again, going back, you think of your key terms of the Cold War, containment. So pursue a policy of détente. You don't go to war in Vietnam to do détente. Marshall Plan, I'm thinking that's 1940s. Vietnam's the 60s. Halt a civil war based on ethnic division. Again, Vietnam wasn't an ethnic war, it was an ideological war. It fits in with containment B. Which of the following actions directed by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would be most acceptable to a supporter of liberalism? I believe we talked about this in our political unit, but we had a question like this that I made on a test. So something that somebody that pro-democracy would like is denouncing Stalin and the cult of personality. From the perspective, following actions is most consistent with the policy of peaceful coexistence. So the idea that the Soviet sphere and the American sphere could coexist, did we see that with the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviets? No, that's the opposite, right? The building of missile sites, no, again, that's confrontation based. Support for South Vietnam, confrontation, agreement, right? Agreement, we can coexist, we agree. So if you understand what the word agreement means and coexistence means, a D just pops out. The ideological conflict that shaped international relations from the end of the Second World War until '89, Cold War, led to the formation of a nuclear arms race by not by a single power, by two. Formation of spheres of influence dominated by the superpowers, you bet. Which of the following statements would a supporter of economic globalization? We looked at that with the economics unit. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was created by the Soviets as a direct response to. So again, how do you get this one right? You got to know your history. Direct response to perceived threat of NATO. So they have their gang, we need our gang. What's our gang going to be? The Warsaw Pact. So not many questions there to test ourselves in this unit, but there's some. And there's some practice on the contemporary world.